Yeah, one thing you really have to understand is that when you're, I don't know, Turks don't look that different from Arabs that are in Syria or Lebanon. They don't look that different from Greeks. So these different ethnic identities which say, there's a fundamental difference between us in terms of, our blood. It's kind of nonsense LARP, Any region of the world, people tend to look very similar and physiologically be very similar, right? So the distinction comes from the fact that people belong to different tendencies. It's not that there's different people. There aren't really different people, actually. Actually, I would apply this to the whole cosmos and the universe. There aren't necessarily different things in existence. There are different tendencies. And as a consequence of the fact that there are different tendencies, that is what gives rise to the appearance of different things. But what is primary is the different tendencies and the different principles. And the principles are not always mutually exclusive, by the way. They're not always incompatible, or they have to annihilate each other or cancel each other out. They just fill a different niche. Okay? So, in some sense, there aren't divisions of mankind into different races and ethnicities. It's not true. There's one mankind, and there's one fundamental pattern of what we call human history and human existence. But because of discontinuities in form, we have different identities. The fundamental tendency of the relationship between nomads who come from steppe or even potentially desert environments, but let's just take Eurasia, for example. Let's just take the Central Asian steppe, for example, right? The steppe, for thousands of years, there prevailed different principles and tendencies, like the Iranic, the so-called Aryan, the Indo-European, then the Turkic. There's no fundamental difference between them in terms of the underlying pattern that they fulfill. It's just that because there's a discontinuity in the form, it appears like these are different peoples conquering each other and erasing and genociding each other. It's not true. Actually, the same people who were Iranic 1,000 years before, let's say, let's say the year is 500 after Christ, 500 AD, 1,000 years before they were Iranic. 1,000 years later, those same people become Turkic because they adopt the language, and the culture of the Turks becomes dominant because on a practical utilitarian level, it makes more logical sense to adopt that language. And most of the time, by the way, the same laws and tendencies that govern history, which people give expression to in one language, let's say the Iranic language or the Indo-European language, when a new revolution happens where, the nomadic honor gives way to some kind of sedentary decadence and corruption, and then, a new nomadic revolution happens, whether it's the Arabs, whether it's the Turks, whether it's other groups, people already have a historical memory and tradition of this happening before, which they've inherited in their own language. So the translation becomes quite seamless, actually. And the translation is the key to the shift and the changes in how one ethnicity gives way to another ethnicity, for example. Like, for example, take the pantheon of the ancient world. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, all had indigenously their own words for a kind of feminine some kind of goddess that's associated with the planet Venus, you know, Ishtar. And when you find another group who just has a different word for it, you're saying, oh, you're talking about Ishtar. Like when we're talking about language, we usually think of it purely in terms of empiricism. If you have a red apple, and there's one language that calls a red apple one thing, okay, in Russian, I know they say apples is like a yabloko or something, right? English, you call it an apple. So, okay, it's the same thing, it's an apple. We're just using different words for the same thing. But these determinations don't just apply to empirical, natural, tangible determinations. They also apply to social principles, right? They also apply to metaphysical principles. Things that relate to the nature of kingship and the cosmos and, you know, the mandate of heaven and so on and so on. So it's not that important in form what people call it. The content is always the thing that matters in history. But because there are discontinuities in the form, this is what gives rise to the appearance of divisions within mankind, right? The need to erase or destroy other languages and heritages and wipe out their memory intentionally is a very modern thing. Historically speaking, the reason people will assimilate into Arab, Persian, Turkic, whatever kind of culture is just because it made more sense to use that specific form of how to describe a given thing, because it was just a more contemporary way of referring to things, right? And the older manner of expression became outdated, so to speak, right? So it's interesting we're talking about nationalism and ethno-nationalism and stuff while I'm in this country, which has a very contentious historical relationship to that. But the pattern of all human civilizations everywhere in the world is basically the same. The cycle that was described by Ibn Khaldun in the Makamuda, right? Of tribal asabiya versus the corruption that arises from the sedentarization is the same story that repeats across all human history, from Gilgamesh to Mao Zedong. It's the same thing. And the reason it's the same thing is because this is a reflection of fundamental cosmic principles that exist and inhere also in nature. Like think of the word, like think of the way Gen Z is just changing and revolutionizing language. Like talking about something like type shit. Like what does type shit even mean, right? I'm sure 100 years ago there was a way to talk about type shit, right? Like I don't know, maybe in fucking 1850 they were like, you know what I mean? I don't know. But it means the same thing. It's just to say it in the older way reflects that you're out of touch, you know, you come from a different era. That's how languages replace older ones. That's how new languages arise and replace older ones. Basically, it's the same thing.